Picture this. A massive, 6-ton biological machine has just collapsed onto the pristine white snow. Our ancestors, after days of exhausting trekking across the frozen tundra, have finally managed to bring down a giant woolly mammoth. In theory, this colossal mountain of meat is the ultimate life insurance policy. It is the exact caloric payload an entire tribe needs to survive the brutal, unforgiving winter. But out here in the desolate chill of the wild, you will not hear any loud cheers or roaring celebrations. Instead, the eyes of the hunters narrow. There is an overwhelming sense of urgency, an intense psychological tension hanging in the air. The mammoth's biological life has ended. But a much more unforgiving battle for survival is just beginning. This time, the opponent is not a predator. It is the absolute laws of physical nature. The ambient temperature around them is plunging to -40 degrees. The air is so incredibly cold that every breath taken forms a thick, momentary cloud of ice crystals before vanishing into the wind. The howling gale cuts through the icy landscape like a physical blade. The researchers who studied this era suggest that these early humans knew they had precisely 60 minutes. Just one single hour. If they missed this golden window of opportunity, those 6 tons of vital nourishment would permanently transform into a solid boulder of ice, harder than steel. And if that happened, the entire tribe would face a quiet, freezing demise under the heavy hand of natural selection. Welcome to our deep dive into the paleoanthropological archives. Have you ever stopped to wonder how, in an era completely devoid of pottery, without metal pots or gas stoves, our ancestors managed to boil water and process massive amounts of frozen meat? The latest archaeological evidence indicates that surviving the Ice Age was never just about brute muscular strength. It was about implementing a highly sophisticated system of food engineering and, surprisingly, microbial management. Let us open the frozen files of history to witness the survival intelligence of a lineage that adapted to the most extreme environmental pressures Earth had to offer. To understand this race against time, we first need to look at the unique biological architecture of the mammoth. When this creature was alive, it possessed a biologically perfect insulation system. Beneath its thick fur lay a layer of solid fat nearly 4 inches deep, combined with specialized antifreeze proteins circulating through its bloodstream. It was an incredible evolutionary adaptation that allowed them to casually wander through -40-degree blizzards. However, the moment that massive heart stopped beating, this exact survival mechanism turned into a ruthless physical trap. Researchers explain that the thick layer of fat suddenly acted as an impenetrable thermal seal. It trapped whatever residual heat was left deep inside the animal's internal organs. Meanwhile, the exterior skin and muscle, completely exposed to the sub-zero air, began to crystallize and freeze at a terrifying speed. In just a matter of hours, a mass the size of 2 city buses would be locked in ice. If a hunter tried to strike this frozen surface, even the sharpest stone blade would shatter and violently bounce back. Therefore, the process of butchering was quite literally a desperate sprint against the rapid thermal drop of the environment. When scientists recently placed the stone tools recovered from these specific archaeological sites under high-powered electron microscopes, they uncovered a reality that completely shifted our modern assumptions. Instead of finding large, beautifully crafted, heavy hand axes, they found that these prehistoric hunters relied heavily on thousands of tiny, seemingly fragile stone flakes. Looking closely at the edges of these flakes, academics noted localized microabrasions and tiny fractures. This is physical evidence of their battle against the hardening, freezing muscle fibers. The strange part is that these flakes were found scattered everywhere, sometimes numbering in the hundreds around a single mammoth skeleton. Why would a resource-scarce people waste so many tools? The answer, as it turns out, is not wastefulness at all. It is a matter of strict food safety protocols. In a world without refrigerators or plastic wrap, microscopic bacteria were the invisible but deadly competitors. If a hunter attempted to slice through the meat with a dull, worn-out stone blade, the mechanical friction would tear and shred the muscle fibers into uneven, jagged edges. In the eyes of a microbiologist, these microscopic tears are essentially open highways, inviting oxygen and rot-causing microorganisms deep into the core of the meat. Conversely, a clean, swift cut from a brand new, razor-sharp stone flake leaves a perfectly smooth surface. A smooth surface significantly reduces the area exposed to the air, drastically slowing down the biological decomposition process. Our ancestors, though they had no concept of modern microbiology, had learned this critical rule of nature through countless generations of observation and adaptation. They treated those simple stone flakes exactly like modern surgeons treat disposable scalpels. The speed of the cut secured their immediate survival, while the sheer clinical precision of the blade determined how long their food would remain safe to consume. But let us assume the butchering process goes perfectly. Another incredibly complex biological puzzle immediately presents itself. The lean meat is only a fraction of the prize. The most concentrated, life-saving energy source lies in the hundreds of pounds of dense, white animal fat. There is a catch, however. The human digestive system simply cannot process massive quantities of solid, raw animal fat. If consumed in its solid state, the human body will reject it, leading to severe gastrointestinal distress and a rapid depletion of energy. To unlock this vital caloric goldmine, the fat had to be rendered 12, 12, 12, 12, and it had to be melted down into a liquid form. Simply put, they needed to boil it. But again, this is an era where baked clay and ceramic pots were concepts that belonged to a distant future, thousands of years away. How exactly do you contain water and bring it to a rolling boil over an open flame when you do not possess a single fireproof container? The solution to this paradox is what archaeologists refer to as the hot stone boiling method. It is an early, rudimentary chemical engineering technique that demonstrates absolute genius in adaptation. Rather than trying to invent a container that could survive the fire, they brought the fire into the container. First, they utilized the intact stomach of the hunted animal, or stitched together thick animal hides to create a durable, waterproof biological pouch. They filled this flexible bag with crushed ice and snow to create water, and dropped in the raw chunks of fat. Simultaneously, in the center of their camp, a massive fire was roaring. They selected specific igneous rocks, like granite, chosen carefully because they would not explode under extreme thermal expansion, and buried them deep inside the glowing embers. They waited until these stones reached a deadly, glowing red hue. The temperature of these rocks could easily exceed 900 degrees Fahrenheit. Using simple tongs fashioned from green wood or antler, they carefully lifted these blazing stones and dropped them directly into the water-filled hide. What happened next was a spectacular display of physics. A deafening hiss erupted as a massive transfer of thermal energy occurred between the rock and the water. The water inside the biological pouch instantly began to violently boil and bubble, steadily melting down the dense chunks of fat. But why did the fragile animal hide not completely incinerate upon contact with a 900-degree stone? The answer lies in the laws of thermodynamics. The water absorbed the entirety of the heat energy to change its physical state. As long as the water temperature did not exceed its boiling point, the hide pouch containing it remained perfectly intact and safe from the heat. The final product of this prehistoric rendering process was a thick, golden layer of liquid oil floating on the surface. This liquid was not just a dense caloric bomb that would keep them alive through the freezing nights. When poured into a small depression in a rock with a piece of dried moss added as a wick, this liquid oil became the very lamps that pushed back the primal darkness of the human story. But securing this liquid gold was only half the battle. The meat itself was still a ticking biological time bomb. Let us dispel a common myth right now. The Ice Age was not a continuous, uninterrupted freeze. Thank you. The Bass for watching. Tap. There were brief, intense periods of summer where temperatures would climb above freezing. In just a matter of days, the sudden warmth could turn an entire tribe's hard-earned stockpile of food into a rancid, rotting nightmare. The solution to this impending disaster was a preservation technique that coated the meat in a protective layer of smoke. However, generating smoke requires fire, and sustaining a fire requires wood. The problem is that the frozen tundra of the Ice Age was practically a treeless desert. Finding enough firewood across those endless, icy plains was a logistical impossibility. To reach the southern forests would take days of travel, and by the time they returned, the meat would already be spoiled. Faced with this impossible scenario, humanity found a deeply paradoxical solution. They burned the bones of the very mammoth they had just killed. Why would bone burn? Deep within the core of these massive bones lies the marrow, and a significant portion of that marrow is pure, highly flammable fat. Even after a bone has been thoroughly scavenged, microscopic traces of oil remain embedded within its porous structure. When placed onto the embers, these bones would slowly combust, releasing a cool, dense smoke that lingered in the air for extended periods. Unlike the rapid, violent combustion of dry wood, this slow, smoldering fire was the absolute perfect mechanism for smoking meat. In fact, archaeological excavations at the Mammoth site in Ukraine have provided startling structural evidence to support this theory. In the center of dwellings constructed entirely from hundreds of mammoth bones, researchers found distinct traces of ash and soot. Academics now hypothesize that these structures were not merely shelters from the cold. They were ingeniously designed smoking chambers, built from bones, fueled by bones, to extend the shelf life of their precious food. Smoking was not their only strategy for food storage. However, deep inside the Qesem cave in central Israel, another remarkable archaeological discovery sheds light on a completely different survival tactic. As archaeologists painstakingly excavated the cave floor, they noticed a bizarre anomaly among the discarded animal bones. There was a massive accumulation of deer bones, but specifically, an unusually high number of perfectly intact leg bones. Typically, prehistoric hunters would immediately smash these long bones to access the nutrient-rich marrow inside. Yet, here they were, piled up and deliberately left unbroken. Initially, this baffled the researchers. Why would they leave the marrow untouched? The analysis soon revealed the answer. These intact bones were their prehistoric emergency rations. The long bones of a deer's leg are naturally sealed at both ends by the joints. Inside this biological vault, the marrow is tightly packed with zero room for air to enter. Because the air is completely cut off, the rate at which the fat oxidizes and spoils slows down to an absolute crawl. The bone itself was functioning exactly like a natural, airtight vacuum seal. It is the exact same principle behind modern canned goods. When the research team conducted an experiment, leaving an unbroken deer bone at room temperature, they tracked the changes over time. Astoundingly, after 9 weeks, the marrow inside was still safe and viable to eat. They had managed to preserve highly perishable fat for over 2 months without any refrigeration whatsoever. While it might not have tasted like a freshly hunted kill, as an emergency food source on a day when the hunt failed, it was more than enough to stave off starvation. This was not just hoarding food, this was a calculated, strategic consumption plan. They were deliberately leaving parts of today's catch untouched to prepare for the inevitable hunger of tomorrow. The hunters of the Ice Age were already designing their future survival right there at the dinner table. But having access to an abundance of meat does not always guarantee survival. In the 19th century, a strange and terrifying phenomenon began to be reported among explorers in North America. They were not starving to death. In fact, they were eating plenty of meat, but they were still dying. They would hunt and eat rabbit after rabbit, yet their bodies would grow progressively weaker until they eventually perished. Later, this physiological paradox was officially documented as rabbit starvation or protein poisoning. The culprit was the overwhelming intake of pure protein. Rabbit meat has an extremely low fat content. The core problem is that the human liver simply cannot sustain its metabolic engine on protein alone. It is like running a massive engine on the wrong type of fuel until it overheats and catastrophically fails. When protein is broken down, it produces toxic ammonia, which requires a massive amount of energy to neutralize. Without carbohydrates or fats to provide this energy, the body starts to cannibalize itself. The more they ate, the faster they deteriorated. The people of the Ice Age knew this. They didn't understand the biochemistry, but they had learned the harsh reality through physical trauma. They understood from bitter experience that a diet consisting solely of lean meat would eventually destroy their bodies. Because of this, they aggressively prioritized the collection and storage of fat. Whether they hunted a mammoth or a reindeer, the fat was always secured first, carefully stored away, and strictly consumed alongside the lean muscle. Fat was not just an extra source of calories, it was a biological antidote, preventing the very protein that sustained them from poisoning them. The image of the Ice Age human as an exclusive carnivore is a modern misconception. Recently, as archaeologists began analyzing the microscopic calculus, or plaque, on prehistoric teeth, a completely different picture emerged. This hardened layer of plaque acts as a biological time capsule, perfectly preserving the dietary history of an individual. When researchers scraped the calculus from teeth that were tens of thousands of years old and viewed it under a microscope, they found a continuous trail of starch granules from wild barley, water lily roots, and various nuts. What is even more fascinating is that these starch granules showed clear signs of thermal alteration. This means they were not eating these plants raw. They were intentionally baking them in the fire or boiling them in water. Tough roots and coarse grains are nearly impossible for the human stomach to digest in their raw state. The application of heat breaks down the complex starch structures, allowing the body to absorb the vital nutrients. The Ice Age humans already understood this fundamental principle of cooking. However, surviving on a strictly plant-based diet introduces another critical flaw in this environment. Essential nutrients, like vitamins A through K, are fat-soluble. They literally require a vehicle made of fat to be transported into the human bloodstream. No matter how many vegetables you consume, without an adequate supply of fat, those vital nutrients will simply pass right through your system unabsorbed. Therefore, humanity learned to combine their plant intake heavily with animal fat. Sometimes, their methods were far more extreme and psychologically jarring. They would literally extract the half-digested plant matter from the stomachs of herbivorous animals they hunted and consume it directly. While it sounds incredibly repulsive to our modern sensibilities, nutritionally speaking, it was an absolute masterstroke. The tough, fibrous plant material had already been broken down by the animal's digestive system, and it was perfectly mixed with the animal's natural digestive enzymes and fats. This resulted in an incredibly high absorption rate for the human body. In an environment where every calorie counted, This was the most brutally efficient way to secure essential vitamins. The mammoth hunt was never a guaranteed success. Even the most skilled group of hunters could face weeks of failure, and if their luck turned, the entire tribe would plunge into a state of severe starvation. Therefore, humanity desperately needed a plan B. They could not afford to gamble their entire existence on the pursuit of megafauna. The alternative lay in the rivers and the coastlines. Freshwater fish, shellfish, and waterfowl may have been significantly smaller, but they were infinitely easier and safer to catch. Migratory fish, like salmon, for instance, reliably returned to the exact same spawning grounds at the exact same time every single year. This predictability was an enormous tactical advantage. You never knew when or where you might encounter a mammoth. But you knew with absolute certainty that the salmon would run up the river every summer. It was a guaranteed, low-risk source of income. Shellfish offered a similar advantage. They didn't run away. They were simply embedded in the mudflats, meaning anyone, from women to children, could safely harvest them. While the caloric value was lower than big game, the supply was steady, and more importantly, their hard shells acted as a natural protective barrier, keeping the meat fresh for several days. The hunting of waterfowl was also strategically focused around their predictable seasonal migrations. Because these birds arrived in massive flocks, hunters could secure a large yield with relatively minimal effort. The Ice Age human was not a simple, single-minded predator. They were highly strategic omnivores who meticulously read the topography of their land, anticipated the rhythms of the seasons, calculated the exact shelf life and fat content of every possible food source, and carefully diversified their dietary portfolio. While the mammoth may have been the main course, the rivers and the sea were the ultimate insurance policy that kept them alive. To live in the present while mathematically calculating the exact moment of tomorrow's hunger, that was the true secret to how Ice Age humanity survived the harshest test of evolution. The mammoths may have gone extinct, but our deep-rooted biological obsession with warm soups and rich, fatty meats remains firmly anchored in the DNA of those ancient, freezing caves 10,000 years ago. So, the next time you sit down to enjoy a hot bowl of soup, perhaps take a moment to reflect on the incredible, brutal wisdom of the chefs who first heated stones on the frozen plains so very long ago. This has been the Earth Museum, bringing you the temperature of knowledge. Do not forget to subscribe and leave a comment to fuel our next journey into the deep past.